One fine dark evening, the whole family gathered in the main hall. They were having dinner and sitting at quite a large distance from each other. The king spoke. His name was Stefan Lux. He turned to his dear daughter and said that she had been coping very well these last few years and was indeed in good condition. Not far from him sat the former queen. Her name was Clarissa Andreas. The king looked at the girl and said that the Valerian Empire had offered his daughter to become the bride of the crown prince. The man also added that she would eventually become empress, and as her father, he could feel nothing but joy. But when Clarissa heard this, she was very indignant. She slammed her hands on the table and said that this crown prince held a grudge against the Andreas family. The girls, of course, did not like the decision he made. She said that their prince had never taken marriage with an enemy country seriously. She assumed that most likely it was some kind of conspiracy since they decided to propose such things so abruptly. So she was not going to trust that family. But the king turned to Clarice in a calm voice and asked if she really thought she had the right to say such things to her sister. But at that moment, Debbie Clara spoke up. She was the current queen. The woman also supported the king in making Clarissa behave differently. The woman said that she was the daughter of Uncle Andres, the traitor who was in this place only by the grace of His Majesty, and asked if she was still unhappy with this. Of course, the girl couldn't answer this, and Debbie also said that getting this place in the old palace was very prestigious. After all, the daughter of an ordinary sinner would never have been able to live such a luxurious life. She believed that the girl should have been, on the contrary, proud that she was given such a chance and not also be picky about it. She explained to the young lady that if Sapphire did get married, her life would become much easier than it had been at that time. In fact, Debbie would also have preferred to choose, for example, Kagare. However, they had no choice because everything had been done in advance, and the choice remained on Sapphire. Kagare was the second princess. She smiled happily and said that she was apparently not as lucky as her sisters. At that moment, she looked directly at her and even began to gloat. When her sister did not answer her, she turned to her father and thanked him for thinking about all this for her sake. The king smiled happily and replied that he had heard some rumors that the crown prince was not only handsome, but also refined and gentle by nature. They continued to have a nice conversation and pretended as if nothing had happened. But in reality, Sapphire was not as happy as everyone else. All because her father did not know that the refined and gentle crown prince was in fact not like that at all. This man was going to attack the capital of Emerithin in a year and kill the entire royal family without even blinking an eye. And of course that included the three of them, those people who weren't even considered part of the marriage agreement. He would have mercilessly cut them all down. And 5 years later, he was supposed to unite the continent and now become the emperor on his own. This story definitely wasn't supposed to end well. When they finally finished their meal, Kagari smiled happily and said that she would already go to His Highness the Crown Prince. In fact, it was the same answer as in Clarice's previous life. She simply stopped this useless resistance because she knew that she could not achieve anything. She had no right to refuse resistance. It would have been a waste of time for her. The girl turned to her sister and asked what she had just said because it was necessary. The girl, who had bright hair, smiled joyfully and turning to her mother said that she would definitely find her happiness, so she didn't have to worry about it. Of course, Clarissa was unhappy. She said that the girl should have understood that this was simply impossible. Even if it was indirect, her grandfather took part in the death of his mother, and now he just wanted to make Clarissa's daughter suffer too. Sapphire ran up to her mother, hugged her tenderly, and said that she should have trusted her. The woman burst into tears. She felt very sorry for her little child, who absolutely did not deserve such treatment. She absolutely did not understand why Sapphire had to undergo such a cruel fate. But the girls did not even have time to say goodbye properly, because the king intervened in the conversation again. He said that this is exactly what one should expect from his daughter Larissa, who was called the Rose of the Desert. If Andreas and his father-in-law had not even tried to raise a rebellion, they could have been very happy. However, this did not happen. In fact, after death, Sapphire's soul wandered around this world for decades, and during this time she also learned something from this crown prince. For example, this was the provision of exchange conditions, because she had no choice, and she had to marry the crown prince. but in response, the girl said that she also had additional conditions. When her father asked what she wanted, Sapphire asked that he leave her mother the title of Duke Andres and return her to the territory of her homeland. Her mother was very surprised. She certainly didn't expect that the girl would want to make her life so easy, but the king became angry. Stefan said that it was not possible, but Sapphire asked if her father understood why they chose her. It was supposed to make her suffer and thus take revenge on the Andreas family. It was obvious that the girl was very valuable to them. She took a knife and put it to her throat. Sapphire said that Valeria had now become the strongest empire in the north, and their kingdom was in constant decline. And if she dies that day, they will use it as an excuse to invade their territory. She challenged her father and asked if he was willing to take the risk and see what would happen. Steph was incredibly angry. However, this is exactly what should have been expected from his daughter. He was very surprised that she proposed such a deal to her father, so he simply thought about everything for a while. Sapphire herself was finally waiting for an answer from him. She was wondering if he would sell her again. The man suddenly smiled smugly and said that the Duke's mansion could not compare with this old palace in any case. After all, in Andreas's family, there was only the girl herself and her mother. It was clear that he was not at all worried about giving her away and about the fact that she could now die. Sapphire was a little upset. She didn't understand what she should have expected from this man. But in fact, he had once truly loved and cherished her. The king was the man who whispered tender words of love to her mother. However, he was also pursuing another woman, and that woman was none other than Sapphire's mother's cousin. The girl was very sad because she did not understand why she wanted to expect anything from this man who was truly hypocritical and selfish, and who would definitely never be able to change. In the end, Sapphire and her mother were finally released, and she kept thinking about what crime she had committed since she had been given such a terrible punishment in life. Even the girl suggested that she would really like for this family to simply end her miserable life in this terrible dungeon. For her, this would be the best solution. In fact, her character once committed suicide at the age of 20. She was executed for poisoning the Alicia by the daughter of the Grand Duke of Castor. In the end, the girl was sold to become the crown princess, and she was accused of a crime she did not even commit. Thus, Sapphire spent her days in a dark prison, enduring the torture of the crown prince, already being engaged to him. Every day she suffered all possible punishments because he considered her a murderer, and she couldn't say a word to him, because then it only got worse. And in the end, even the wish for her quick death could not be fulfilled. She no longer desired anything. She had no strength left for anything. However, no one gave her such mercy. Sapphire. One day, sitting in the dungeon, covered in bruises, she heard the name of the third prince of Leander. He was a great duke who volunteered to serve in the frozen northern territories, and there were rumors that he was very cruel, and no one ever dared to even approach him. Sapphire believed that if he had taken control of her, he would have killed her long ago, because she was a useless insect. So that evening in her past life, when he came to her, she took him by the robe that hung on the man and began to beg him to kill her. Eventually, the man wiped away her tears. He asked her for forgiveness and actually fulfilled her wish. These were the last words the girl heard in her previous life. However, at that moment, she finally felt relief because her suffering was over. In reality, Sapphire was supposed to be a noble princess. However, she was also burdened with expectations. And when this happened to any princess who was supposed to have influence, fate simply tore her into several small pieces because no one could withstand such pressure. Absolutely all princesses, and not only should have been destroyed at that moment, after they lost their chance to benefit everyone else around. And the word that would ideally describe Sapphire's life would be exactly a chess piece. After all, I always controlled her and could easily exchange her life. When the girl was on the verge of death, she simply took and disappeared in an instant, because, as in chess, she was exchanged for another piece that was more useful in that game. After failing to reach an agreement with her father, Sapphire headed to the Valorian Empire, the imperial capital of Vanesh. When the girl was driving there, she realized that everything was exactly as she remembered, and this saddened her even more. After all, she knew what was waiting for her ahead. 7 years ago, the Valerian Empire was a small and remote country, poor in resources and geographically difficult. When her grandfather was still alive, The empire was constantly exploited by the king of the kingdom of the emirate, and the hero of the kingdom was the one who truly loved her. This man was her grandfather. His name was Iker Andreas. He really loved his daughter and granddaughter very much. Like Clarissa's father, the woman was known as the Desert Rose, and the two of them were a symbol of their country's prosperity. But the hypocritical and rather cowardly Father Sapphire succumbed to the influence of words that flattered him. Without hesitation, he executed her grandfather and imprisoned her mother in a secluded palace. Icarus Andreas was found guilty of treasonable collaboration with the enemy without grounds for appellation. So that day he was to be removed from office and executed immediately. Ultimately, with the loss of grandfather Sapphire, the kingdom also lost its glory and honor, and it was irrevocably changed forever. In just a few years, Valorea has consumed almost half of the surrounding countries. And the man who brought the empire countless victories would be the same guy who freed Sapphire from torment in her past life. Leander was the third prince of the empire and had the glory of the bloodied beast. But at the same time, others say that in the distant castle of Sissi, he could show any cruelty he wanted. But no one has yet revealed the true reason why the third period decided to leave the country, and all because his life turned out to be too short. Before anyone could find more information, he died. Then the Grand Duke arrived on the same day as Sapphire, and his carriage passed right past her carriage, which greatly surprised the girl, because she was also able to see him. He returned to the capital so quickly only because the Empress fell ill. The time when the Empress recovered was immediately after Sapphire was thrown into prison. But to be more precise, after he brought her death, he immediately left the capital. He did not intend to stay there for long. After he returned back to his city, he was immediately sent to the battlefield by the recently crowned Felix. When Sapphire passed by the town heading straight to the imperial palace, she was amazed because the empire was still alive then, and did not at all resemble the kingdom in which she lived. The girl really dreamed of turning her useless father into the cobblestones of this capital. He should have understood how stupid he was, and what a mistake he made in his life. He took and brazenly destroyed the kingdom that their ancestors worked so hard and built, and it was not even clear why it was done. Sapphire already knew what to expect from her father, so she was curious what kind of person Leander really was. She knew absolutely nothing about him, only rumors that she could hear from people around her. The whole world called him a cruel egoist, but he never actually spoke to her like that. On the contrary, he showed her his mercy. But those eyes that she saw at the last moment were full of immeasurable sadness. They could only belong to a man with a heart of snow. So she did not understand at all why such rumors were circulating about him. Sapphire could on a dog, but only her savior. Therefore, she was interested to find out what kind of person he really was. In fact, she really wanted to communicate with him more. When the residents who were on the streets saw the princess's carriage passing by, they immediately began to wave to her. She was a kind soul, so she also greeted many and waved back. But looking more closely at the crowd of people, she noticed that a man was also there. He was riding behind her, so she was even a little glad to see him. Listen, she actually felt the same as in her past life. As expected from the third principal, who was the most revered emperor, his presence was truly overwhelming. Therefore, when people saw him on the streets, they immediately began to disperse and bow. Moreover, the man was accompanied by a very large army of knights. When the girl entered the estate, she was glad that no one came to meet her. This was all thanks to Felix's order. Of course, none of the important people knew that there was a princess inside. All this was carefully hidden. In her past life, she also waited until the Leander's escort passed by, and while this was happening again, the girl kept thinking about why he decided to spare her and save her. She thought she should have known this because maybe he was just pretending to be cruel. Maybe he could even be the one who could really save her this time. Sapphire knew that if she could get help from him this time, then perhaps she could find out who betrayed her grandfather. This way she will be able to save both her mother and the maid Ella, and even the people who have been helping her all this time. However, in this life, everything was completely different because of the rumors she heard from people around her. She couldn't even look a man in the eye calmly. When Leander drove past her and looked into her window, she quickly looked away. The girl was incredibly scared. She assumed that all the rumors that were circulating about him were true. Because of this, she simply lost the chance to get to know him and learn something more in the future. Because of this, Sapphire was very upset because she did not think that she could be so scared. At that moment, an idea came to her mind. She decided that if she could change something right then and there, it would help her. Therefore, plucking up her courage, Sapphire turned to the man and asked him to listen to her. In fact, her voice still sounded quite quiet, despite the fact that she tried to speak loudly. She really hoped that in this way she would still be able to survive. When the man heard that someone was talking to him, he noticed that the carriage was from the Emirates. Leander assumed that it was probably one of Felix's toys, so he didn't pay much attention to the person who was in the carriage. Well, the girl was very persistent. She opened the door so that she could be seen and turned to His Highness. She knew that if she did not do everything possible now, she would never be able to. She didn't care at all how small her chances were. She just couldn't let this situation go. Sapphire opened the door and looked at the man. She smiled happily in greeting. When Leander saw this girl, he was even a little embarrassed. He definitely didn't expect this. In the end, the man didn't even say a single word to her. He simply sped up and didn't understand how the girl could even smile in such a situation. Sapphire herself was very shocked. She did not understand why he just drove away from her at high speed so that her carriage would definitely not be able to catch up with him. In the end, it was not even evening yet when the girl arrived at the palace of Cathai. She walked along the corridors accompanied by a maid, but in fact it was the place that limited her like a cage for a bird. Sapphire was very saddened that she returned to a place that was filled with the most haunting memories from her past life. The man always treated her terribly. He mocked her, beat her, and always humiliated her. So when she walked along the familiar corridors, she could not contain her emotions and burst into tears. She could not believe that despite all this, she continued to trust him so much that in the end, she did not even suspect that he could commit such a betrayal against her. It was completely stupid of her to expect mercy from the crown prince of an enemy country. Therefore, the girl did not understand how she could even hope for anything. As she continued to pass through familiar landscapes, she realized that absolutely nothing had changed in this place. The only thing that greeted the girl in this place and could make her happy was the ruined palace and the stuck rose that bloomed in the garden, and also the sky, which was incredibly sad, just like her, that day, all the time without stopping after Sapphire entered the palace grounds. It was raining heavily, and there was a terribly unpleasant thunderstorm. At that moment, she felt simply disgusting, and only one thought was spinning in her head. She really wanted to run away from this place. While the girl was thinking about all this, a maid suddenly turned to her and said, "Her name is Marilyn." She was Felix's main maid. She apologized to Sapphire, but said that some renovation work was being carried out at Greta's palace at the time, and therefore she would have to remain in such inconvenience for some time. The girl smiled and said that she didn't care at all that they wanted to put her in an extension, and she didn't object to it, but she really hoped that in this country there would at least someday be sunny days. Marilyn looked at the princess with suspicion. She said that His Highness the Crown Prince was very busy, so he could not come to her now. He would greet her when all matters were settled. The girl replied that she understood everything, but she only thought that she would have preferred that he not come to her. However, she understood that this was unlikely. In fact, even in her previous life, the head maid always hated the girl, and this life was no exception. From the very beginning, she showed the utmost disrespect towards her. When Marilyn brought her to the girl's room, she said that she would send her luggage there a little later, and her personal maid would also come a little later. The girl told her to rest a little after the journey. Sapphire, closing the door behind her, thanked her and tried to figure out how she could avoid this girl for as long as possible. The girl knew that a lot would have changed if she had understood from the very beginning the meaning of her cold looks in her past life. She believed that perhaps everything would have ended completely differently, perhaps not even as tragically as it happened. In the end, but in the past, she could no longer do anything. In fact, Sapphire prayed so hard for the rain to stop that day that she was incredibly scared. However, unfortunately, this did not happen, no matter how much she wanted it. The next morning, the Minister of Family Affairs and his friend Neville decided to meet with Crown Prince Felix. The man smiled happily and turned to Felix and asked if he really wasn't going to visit the girl he had brought to his estate. For him, this was a little surprising. He also said that even if the princess had gone all this way, there was no one to greet her. However, even the fact that the man himself did not want to go there, in his opinion, was a little too much. However, Felix, who was a tall, muscular blonde man, said that there was no need for this at all. At that moment, he went to the window and saw that Leander had driven into his territory, with sweat running down his face because he had just returned from an intense workout. As soon as he knocked on the door, a maid opened it for him. She said that having heard all about his return, the Empress wished to greet her, but unfortunately this did not happen. At this point, Felix turned to his friend and said that Leander had returned, and, upon hearing this, said that it was quite natural given the fact that his mother was ill. That is why he was not at all surprised, but his friend Sev, on the contrary, said that if Her Majesty recovers and quietly returns to the castle of Sisay, then they will finally be able to be absolutely calm. Neville laughed and said that he shouldn't be so suspicious of his half-brother. He believed that he was definitely not capable of any serious misdeeds. Also, while sipping his hot tea, the man said that Her Majesty the Queen is a very beautiful person. Felix, hearing something like this, immediately looked at him in surprise. He asked what the guy was talking about and why he suddenly decided to mention the Queen. He said that according to rumors, she is like a shining gemstone, and anyone who sees her for a moment will be enchanted by her wonderful beauty. Moreover, they also say that her singing is like the singing of a lark. He would definitely like to hear it someday because he loved music very much. Felix was not as inspired as his friend. He said that he saw her mother and grandfather, so he could imagine what her facial features would look like, and he certainly would not admire her so much. After that, he asked if he had really been absent all day only because he had gone there to look at her after all. At this moment, Neville became very embarrassed. He laughed nervously and said that he was not as lazy as he thought. In order to change this awkward topic of conversation, he remembered that he knew another very important rumor that he considered necessary to share. Felix knew his nature very well, so he poured another cup of tea and asked what it was. At that moment, the man smiled happily and said that it seemed to him that she opened the carriage door on the main street and smiled at the Duke of Leander himself. He heard people say that the Duke's troops, along with the Leander himself, were walking at the same time as her carriage, and it was for this reason that they crossed paths with each other in this way. In the end, he even checked this information with the secretary and also said that many people thought that she gave him a very sweet smile, which meant that she had a good attitude towards him. At this point, Felix suddenly began to get very angry, but Neville continued. He said that from the very beginning, the man only considered her as a hostage and had no intention of making her a bride in the present, so he could not worry about it at all. He even suggested that perhaps there was some possibility that she would want to stay with the Duke. Neville thoughtfully said that if the Duke forgives His Highness out of love for the child, then he could simply allow them to be together. After all, everyone saw the man present there at that moment, and they all said the same thing. He himself thought that Lady Sapphire would be a much better match for the Duke of Edinburgh than for Felix. After a short silence, his friend asked again if he really still believed that it was a very good idea not to even meet her. Felix said in a very rude voice that it was hard for him to believe that the daughter in Andrea's family could be so stupid since she believed that something could work out. But Neville replied carelessly that he doubted that the princess, who was imprisoned in a secluded palace, understood political maneuvers and all that sort of thing. He said that she is a hostage. It will be difficult for her if she does not have at least a few reliable allies on her side. Smiling, the man also asked if Felix had thought the same thing. At that moment, Sapphire was sitting in her room, thinking about the crown prince all the time. In fact, the person whom the man himself hates and despises has now become like a thorn in his heart on this day. She knew very well how suspicious and cruel he was, and the deeper the act, the more satisfied the man would be in the end. In the evening, several maids, walking around the place, began to discuss the situation they had learned about that day. One of the maids whispered that the cat's palace was so remote and eerie, she had heard that someone had even died in this place. Her partner agreed and said that Prince Felix probably despised the girl, otherwise he would definitely not have sent her to that place. However, the maid warned her partner to pay close attention to what she was saying, because the princess was the future empress. The girls continued arguing among themselves for a while. However, the head maid Marilyn intervened in their conversation. She approached one of the girls and hit her very hard on the cheek. After this, the woman said in a rough voice that this slap was Dana on behalf of Princess Sophia, and also advised the girl in the future to simply know her place so that this does not happen again. The woman said that she was nothing more than a servant, and if she allowed herself one more disrespectful word, the main servant would send her back to the pleasure district. The maid immediately asked for forgiveness. She began to beg her for mercy and said that this would never happen again, and everything in that spirit. After this, the rest of the maids went off to do their duties, and a girl named Kelly remained standing to the side. She was still holding her red cheek and wondering what she had been doing with the head maid. The girl just, in her opinion, behaved so arrogantly and domineering when she was simply a waste of time that no one was interested in. She will definitely never forget this humiliation and was even going to take revenge on her for this. At that moment, everyone except Kelly went into the princess's room to get to know her. Sapphire, meanwhile, had already changed into one of her beautiful outfits. She was sitting on the sofa and allowed the maids to enter. When the girls were inside, Marilyn stepped aside and said that these were her maids, who would now personally serve her and help her with all the necessary things. Sapphire greeted them with a joyful smile and said that she was very glad to meet them. Meanwhile, Kelly had already arrived, and Eva and Ellie were also there. The girl smiled, but she thought that quite a lot of time had passed since she last saw them. However, it played into her hands that this was her second life in this body, so she knew the character of all of them very well. The girl turned to the maids and said that she was feeling a little unwell that day, so she asked Ellie to take care of the luggage. After this, smiling happily, she also added that she would definitely officially meet with everyone else tomorrow and get to know each other a little better. Before leaving, Marilyn warned Elle to be sure to serve her well. The girl was a little worried, but said that she would do everything at the highest level. When everyone left, Sapphire was very happy that she was left alone with her most faithful servant, so she was even able to relax a little and breathe out. Marilyn was as suspicious as Felix, and that is why even simple words aroused the most suspicion towards her. The girl knew that if she refused the servants Eva and Kelly, Felix would definitely suspect her, so she simply had to leave them. But in fact, even the thought of living under their constant surveillance terrified her very much. Even thinking about it was painful for her, so she decided to enjoy at least this day when she could spend it without them. And Elle was a very sweet and innocent girl. When she saw the princess, she immediately thought that the emperor would definitely fall in love with her, because she herself had already managed to do so. The head maid was very surprised when she walked out the door. It was obvious that she would want to choose the nicest maid of all. She had just arrived in an unfamiliar place, so it was quite natural that she chose the one with whom she thought it was easiest to communicate. Or, in addition, even when she entered the room, she began to smile. And in general, the atmosphere with her was very unobtrusive. They went further. However, the main thing is that the maid also asked Eva to come to her office a little later. The maid, of course, was very surprised, but said that she would definitely do it. Ellie, meanwhile, asked the princess what she was doing at all, because the girl quietly walked up to the door and put her ear there in order to eavesdrop on their conversation. This was very strange and suspicious. Of course, Ellie thought she was eavesdropping on the conversation, but in fact, Sapphire was waiting until they were completely far away so that she wouldn't hear anything from the room. After everything had calmed down, she very quickly ran up to her maid and began to hug her tightly with a smile on her face. In fact, she was really very happy to finally meet Ellie. She was a very good person and sincere. The maid herself did not understand the princess's behavior at all. It was all very strange, but in the end she did not push her away, because that would have been very impolite on her part. At that very moment, Felix finally finished talking with Neville. When they began to disperse, he said to his hands that, after everything that was said, they did not even meet, so he considered His Highness a truly heartless person since he did this. Felix ignored his hint. He said that if he was so interested, he asked why the man himself didn't go there and meet her. Neville, of course, screamed loudly and said that he did not even dare to think about it at that moment. They suddenly accidentally bumped into Leander, who was walking towards them. The man immediately bowed to the crown prince and said that a very long time had passed since they last crossed paths. Felix made a rather friendly smile and told him not to show such formalities to his family, so that he could behave naturally and calmly. Then Neville spoke up, asking how the man had been doing lately, since he had heard that Sisay's castle had become very prosperous and even Venetia couldn't cope with it properly. Before Neville let the man speak, he also added that he was thinking about opening his own business in addition to his job at the Ministry of the Imperial Household. It was the most boring thing he had ever done. Leander smiled and said that thanks to them, they were coping with the session. It was very cold, and without money, they definitely couldn't survive. So he wished that the man would be very careful. Felix interrupted their pleasant conversation and said that if he wanted to open his own business, the man could approve his resignation on behalf of His Majesty. The man was a little worried. He thanked the Crown Prince and said that it would be very generous on his part. After that, they moved on to another topic. They chatted pleasantly for a while. Then Leander looked out the window and said that it was already starting to get dark. After these words, Felix suddenly became very serious and asked the man if he had any plans since he was so closely watching the darkening street. The guy replied that his meeting with the wolf was quickly approaching, so he would come to talk with the Crown Prince another time, because now he really needed to hurry there. Felix, hearing about the wolf, immediately frowned and asked if he really meant that same Edmund at the wolf. The man looked at the Leander with apprehension and asked if he had even heard all the rumors that were circulating about this person. But the guy behaved completely calmly. He said that judging by Felix's reaction, they were not very good, but fortunately he did not hear anything, so he could not say anything about it. Felix got angry when he heard this. He said that his father had condemned him many times, and if Leander did not want to displease him, then it would be wise not to get involved with him at all. The man didn't care much about this and asked if Felix really took all this so seriously. The man also said that he just needed to seduce a few women. That was the end of it. But Felix took all of this very seriously. Lost in thought, he said that these women were all daughters of noble families. Duke Edmund was on the verge of death. He did not speak and was consulted by the court physician several times. Leander replied with a smile on his face that he really hoped that the man was simply taking care of himself in this way and that there was nothing serious about it. If he had the opportunity to see him, he would definitely recommend that he engage in physical exercise to maintain his health. After that, he said that if there was nothing more to say to them, then he would already go. The man did not give birth to you, but only, after saying goodbye to him, they followed him with their eyes for some time. After he left, Neville, smiling happily, asked if the Grand Duke was really coming to meet him or if he simply wanted to go for his own amusement. Felix immediately became even more serious. He said that since someone went to the castle, he had been doing whatever he wanted, away from his father's watchful eye. But Neville believed that this was in fact a very advantageous position for the Crown Prince, since in this way, Leander was simply lowering his bar. But Felix didn't think so, because he believed that it would be one thing if he did it on his own territory. However, for him to tarnish the name of the imperial family while in Vanish, that would be very mean on his part. Of course, being his older brother, he couldn't just look the other way and not take any action when this happened on his territory. Then his friend asked if His Highness would like him to look after the Grand Duke. Felix started to leave and said that if a man had too much free time, then of course he could do whatever he wanted. What he was doing had nothing to do with him, so he was not going to get involved in all this. Neville immediately smiled maliciously, understood his hints, and said that of course it was just his own irresistible curiosity, and he could not do anything about it. At that very moment, Leander actually went to the meeting as he had told his older brother. As always, there were a lot of women in that place, and as soon as they saw him, they immediately began to whisper to each other and spread even more rumors. The man passing by them didn't even pay attention. He just looked angrily at these girls and didn't understand why they always had to meddle in other people's business. Then the girls immediately became ashamed. They lowered their heads and said nothing more because they understood that he could even punish them very seriously. At that moment, Leander thought that his reputation was much worse than even Volka's, and this upset him greatly. Then he went into the office where the wolves were sitting. He was the captain of the Imperial Knights, and beautiful women were developing all around him. When the man approached him, the guy immediately turned to him, saw Leander, immediately smiled and said that he was very glad that he finally came to him. The man, looking at all these girls who were practically devouring him with their eyes, asked the wolves to order them to leave. The man smiled happily, stroked one of the women, and told them to go out for a while. He and the Grand Duke needed to discuss something else in private. The girls immediately stood up and began to leave. When they passed by Leander, they looked at him cautiously. But at that moment, Leander continued the conversation with Volky and said that on the way to this place he met Jade, who was, as always, tearful. He asked the man not to mock him so much because he speaks as if he is a bad guy. Although in fact, this was not true at all. In fact, Jade was the secretary of the Imperial Knights. When he first saw the Leander, he asked in a trembling voice to tell the captain of the wolves to return back to work. In fact, the guy couldn't even look him in the eyes, and Leander couldn't believe that he really looked so scary that the man was afraid to even approach him. When the wolves heard this fascinating story, he immediately laughed loudly and told his friend to sit down next to him and pour him some wine. However, Leander was not as happy as his friend, saying he asked him to spread bad rumors rather than slander him. But the man did not understand why he was making a claim against him, because he considered it one and the same. It reduced Felix's vigilance, so the wolves believed that he should thank him and not blame him. The man took his glass of wine and said that he was not interested in the throne at all. Besides, Felix was not guaranteed to believe such rumors, so it was a failed plan. His friend replied that Felix was certainly a suspicious person, but since all the complaints at the moment were directed at Leander, it seemed to him that he had still let his guard down a little. So he advised his friend not to worry about it, but just stay close to His Majesty the Emperor. The man decided to change the subject of the conversation and asked if the wolves had really decided to continue living in this place. After all, if he continued this, he would definitely never be able to get married. Of course, the man was not worried about this at all, because his father was actively involved in this issue and arranged many dates for him over the past year. And the man himself believed that you can find love on your own, so he was never going to give in to his father. For some time they discussed love affairs, and at that moment, Leander just sat and listened. But then, suddenly the wolf said that if a man called all these blind dates disasters, then for Princess Sapphire, sending her as a bride to an enemy country must have been just real hell. Therefore, he believed that his father might not have been so cruel. Knowing Felix, he probably hates the princess's family, so he was wondering how he was going to torture this poor girl. At this point, Leander smiled and said that, even while entertaining women, the captain of the Walker still cares about the Bumper family. So he was a little surprised by this. Now the man was completely unsurprising that his father constantly simply forgave him, but the guy explained that he was doing this. After all, the imperial family had the most material for gossip, and he really loved this business. Then the wolves said that this girl arrived in the capital at the same time as him. However, they did not even set a date for her banquet. He also said that it seemed to him that they did not even prepare an honorary army to meet her, and forced her to stay in a very remote Kotai palace in order not to see anyone. If Felix continues to treat her like this, then the rest of the kingdom will certainly continue to bully her as well. At that moment, Leander thought, and realized that this girl was a really good person. He is sure that if Felix met her at least once, he would definitely be able to change his opinion of her. And it was really so. The girl really was a very sweet and good person. After she hugged Ellie, the girl turned to the princess and asked what was wrong with her, and why she showed kindness only to her. Sapphire smiled happily and said that the girl was incredibly soft and smelled very nice, so she just couldn't stop hugging her. After that, she looked the girl straight in the eyes and could not take her eyes off her. At that moment, tears even began to flow down her cheeks. Ellie, seeing this, of course, was very scared. She immediately turned to the princess and in an alarmed voice asked why she suddenly burst into tears. The girl had already begun to worry that she had done something wrong, and she also wondered if the princess really missed her homeland, or if she was feeling unwell for some reason. But Sapphire, without answering a single question, just took and put her hands on her neck. She said that she would like to carefully examine her sweet face. In fact, in her life, which seemed to be on the edge of an abyss, there were still some flowers blooming. And one of these flowers was Ellie herself. However, Ellie's life was also very difficult in her miserable circumstances, as her parents, who were burdened with debts, simply sold her and brought her to this place. Like other rumors about Ellie's servants, she was originally supposed to be a spy for the crown prince, but in the end, she began to protect the princess and was always there. The girl was very supportive of her and always consoled her. She even took her side when something unimaginable happened in her previous life. Although everyone was absolutely convinced that Sapphire was the culprit of the death, the girl was the only one who believed in her. And in the end, she cruelly paid for it with her life. And they did it on purpose, right in front of Sapphire's eyes. Of course, it was hard for her to watch Elia leave this life with a smile on her face. However, the girl, even then, being on her deathbed, was still faithful to her. At the moment when she was there, no one could hear her voice. However, only Sapphire knew what exactly the girl said. In fact, she turned to her princess and said that in the next life, she should never live like this again. Of course, Sapphire could never in her life forget the man who gave his life for her. It was incredibly valuable to her. And now, being already in a new life, Ellie still continued to support her. She hugged the princess when she burst into tears and said that she would always be there for her. She did not know what happened. However, she wanted the girl not to be sad anymore. This really managed to calm down Piefer. Then she smiled and began to wipe away her tears, and said that when they were alone she could not officially call her princess, but simply call her by her first name. Of course, the girl immediately began to resist. She said that for a low-born girl like her, calling the princess by her name was simply illegal. But Sapphire interrupted her. She told the girl to never talk about herself like that. She was a dear person to her, and therefore she really asked that Ellie address her less formally than everyone else. Of course, the maid wanted to resist again. However, she realized that it was pointless and that she had to carry out the princess's order in any case, so she agreed to it. When the girl finally called her by her first name, Sapphire immediately ran up to her and hugged her tightly. She sincerely thanked the maid for listening to her. When the next day came, the girl had a simply brilliant plan that she decided to implement together with Ellie. But the maid was a little scared. She asked, was she really going to sneak out of the place where she was locked up? It was something very brave. But the girl also said that they could have been attacked at any moment. And besides, she had a lot of questions about how the princess knew that there would be no reliable security in this place. Sapphire didn't answer anything. She just smiled and said that the goddess told her about it in a dream, which meant everything was fine. So she asked the maid to just calm down and trust her. The girl specially disguised herself. She wore more discreet men's clothing and hid all her long hair. In fact, she wanted to see the whole city immediately. As soon as they reached the observation platform, they were delighted. Of course, this was very little for the girl, so she took her maid straight to the city. In fact, on this day, Kelly was supposed to come to help the girl with preparations. But she knew that if the door did not open, she would think that she was still sleeping and would leave. Kelly has always disliked her and kept her distance, so she will use this as an excuse to just take a walk. Meanwhile, the firm itself will calmly relax in the pleasant company of Ellie. The girls went to the market. They walked around and bought quite a lot of different souvenirs and gifts. They were really happy to spend time like that. When Sapphire finally finished shopping, she said in an admiring voice that the market was incredibly big and lively. She never thought that shopping could be such an exciting activity. The maid was a little surprised that the girl got so much pleasure from a simple shopping activity. However, she was happy that the girl liked everything. They continued walking, and then suddenly Sapphire saw some interesting building around which a lot of different people were gathering. So they became interested in what was happening there. And Ellie replied that they provide special services there, this type of service, but it was very dangerous to stay there, because if the nobles saw them, it would be a big problem for all of them. The princess realized that this was not a joke, so she agreed to leave there as quickly as possible. But at that moment, the girl suddenly turned her head to the side and saw a very familiar face passing by. This man turned out to be Leander. He was holding the wolves, because he was already too drunk to even walk to Rivna himself. The man resisted all the time and said that he needed to go back because he had promised the girl. But Leander, of course, did not listen to him and took him to the carriage so that he could go back. When the princess saw him, she immediately adjusted her hat so that her face was not visible. She never expected that she could meet a man in such an unexpected place. Of course, she would really like to come closer to him, but it would be very bad if she were seen now. So she took Ellie by the hand and began to lead her in the other direction. The girl said that they needed to leave immediately. Leander heard some noise not far from him. The girls were running. He immediately turned his head to the side. However, he only saw their legs. In fact, he felt like someone was looking at him recently. However, he assumed that it was Felix's spy, so he decided not to dwell on it too much. Sapphire was amazed that these two were returning from this club in the morning, which meant that they spent the whole night there, which of course worried the girl. Ellie said that they provided special services there, which of course meant intimate things. Because of this, the girl was shocked and even angry, because she certainly did not expect this from a man. They continued walking and walked along the road and felt that someone was walking behind them. The girls understood that it was very dangerous to stay there, so they agreed to count to 3, and after that, they would run away from this alley incredibly quickly. But at that moment, a man came out to meet them. He had a large scar on his head and was holding a huge weapon in his hands. He smiled at the girls and said that it was very brave of them to walk around without an army. When Ellie saw this man, she of course recognized him. It was the young master. They needed to run away because he was incredibly dangerous. In the end, the girls decided to try to escape anyway. They even threw away some of the gifts they were holding in their hands in order to distract his attention. But I managed to run far because the other entrance was blocked by his assistants. They stood in their way and told the girls not to hurry so much. The princess understood that they probably needed money, so she voluntarily gave them a bag with her savings so that they wouldn't be beaten, and asked them to take it and let them go. At that moment, a man with a scar approached them. He abruptly took the bag of money from her and said that he would gladly take it for himself. After that, he poured out the gold coins. When he saw this, he immediately laughed and asked if the girl was really just making fun of him. He expected to see a large sum of money there. He told the princess to immediately take out everything else she had because he was sure that she had more money. And to be more convincing, he even presented his sword to her throat. At that moment, another man approached Ella and grabbed her. The girl was incredibly scared. She had never been in such situations before, so she didn't even know what to do. Sapphire then screamed at these men. She said that it was not fair at all. She had already given them all her money, so she asked them to let them go calmly already. When the man seriously thought about it and realized that there really was no possible way for such a special guy like him to carry so much gold with him. Of course, they perceived the girl as an ordinary, simple guy. However, at that moment, he threw the money aside, smiling maliciously. The man said that, of course, this would definitely not be enough for him. He told the princess that she could now be their hostage and help them earn a much larger sum than they now had. Sapphire was a little worried, in fact. Refugees are people who lost their home due to war, natural disasters, or unemployment. They did not have a stable income to live somewhere in one place. They constantly had to find ways to survive. They were used to doing various break-ins or robberies, so the girl knew that her mind would not influence them, and she would not be able to provide them with any arguments. The man, meanwhile, began to approach her closer. Of course, she was very scared. The girl told them not to take another step towards her, but to remain standing in place. At that moment, Ellie screamed loudly, telling the girl to forget about her and just run away to save her life. Of course, the princess could not do that. She told her maids that of course they would help her free herself. When she began to move further and further away, she noticed an iron handle lying below, and the girl thought that this was an excellent opportunity for self-defense. She grabbed it and now pointed it towards the man. Sapphire said that if they don't let her go immediately, she will definitely regret it. The girl also said that this is the capital of Vanessa Valore. His Majesty the Emperor never shows mercy to you, not to crimes. So the girl asked, are they really willing to continue to take such risks even knowing this? She would be scared with me. However, her hands did not shake because the girl knew that fear would not help her. She continued to intimidate these men at that very moment. Leander stood behind the wall and heard all of this perfectly well. He even smiled. In fact, he did not expect that this girl could be so selfless. The men exchanged glances at each other, and Sapphire continued to intimidate them, telling them to come to her now. She had something to defend herself with, so she could easily defeat these men without even blinking an eye. Leander understood that it was best to intervene. He put on a special mask so that no one would recognize him, and he thought that she was not at all like the princess he had heard about in all those rumors. And this is precisely what began to attract him even more. At that moment, men really began to approach her closer. They thought that she definitely could not do anything to them, so they even began to mock her. When they were already very close, Sapphire simply began to swing her iron stick from side to side and thus hit the man with the scar very hard on the head, so that he even started to bleed. When he saw this, he immediately became even more angry. He shouted at his assistant and told him to immediately grab her, and also added that she would definitely pay for what she had done to him. Ellie, of course, immediately worried about the young lady. She understood that these men would now be very cruel, but she could not do anything. Then one of the robbers approached Ela and told the girl to look carefully at what was about to happen. When Sapphire turned her head, she saw that they hit Ellie very hard on the head. She also started bleeding. She fell to the ground and lost consciousness due to the fact that the blow was very strong. The girl immediately ran to her. She took her in order to stop the bleeding and try to bring her to her senses. The man had already run up to her. They wanted revenge, and now Sapphire. However, the Landers, who had already removed the mask and decided that it was time to intervene, said that this was enough. Of course, the hooligans didn't expect anyone to come to save this mongrel. So for a while, they just looked at him in surprise. One of them took out his knife and immediately ran towards this guy in order to wound him and asked who he was. Of course, Leander easily blocked his blow, and after that, with one hand, he simply hit the man against the wall. He immediately fell and lost consciousness. Everyone around immediately became scared. However, they began to take revenge for their partner, so they also ran to the attack. After he easily defeated them all, the man said that they received the money, therefore they needed to leave immediately in order not to get into even more trouble for themselves. The guy with the scar, having fallen to the ground, immediately asked Leander not to kill his brother because he pointed his sword at him. He said that it was certainly their fault, and they were very sorry. The man replied that they were all humble, disabled veterans who no one needed, and that in the end, they were simply desperate, and therefore committed crimes such as robberies. They felt very sorry for them. However, they could not do otherwise. After a short silence, the man shouted again and said that if this was punishment, he was ready to accept it. But he asked that the man at least spare his brother. It was precisely because he was weak that the man simply took and involved his brother in all of this. He himself did not want to do this. So the man with the scar really hoped that Leander would somehow take pity on him. The man then glanced at the girl who was still sitting in the corner. He said that if she said that she forgives him, then he would let him go. The thief immediately ran up to her. He turned to the lady in a trembling voice and asked for forgiveness. He said that they would of course return her money and would not bother her anymore. The guy actually gave her a bag of money, after which he fell on his knees in front of her and bowed. He said that all we wanted was just money to survive the winter. However, they got a little carried away. He explained that when she hit him with a stick, he lost his temper and ended up hurting a woman he didn't want to hurt, and he felt incredibly sorry for that. Then he looked at the Sapphire and said that he was ready for any punishment, so he really asked her to forgive them, because he did not want anything to happen to his brother. However, Leander soon interrupted him, telling him to stop talking, and adding that if he didn't want to continue living like this, it would be best to join the knighthood. The man said that Captain Edmund's unit, Volki, was short of personnel, so the guy could come and tell him that he came on Lin's recommendation. The man would understand everything, and then they would have something to live on. The beaten robbers immediately began to run away, but before that they bowed before the man and thanked him for it. Then Leander sat down next to the girl. He asked if everything was okay with her. Sapphire, meanwhile, had already allowed herself to show emotion. She burst into tears and said that her sister was injured. The man immediately took Ellie in his arms and told the girl to come with him. He was ready to take care of this unfortunate victim. Soon after that, he took her to a special room. There they put Ellie, and he also said that he had already called the doctor, who was supposed to come soon to carefully examine her. Sapphire, without taking her eyes off her maid, thanked him. The man, looking at her, noticed that she was indeed quite small. He had not noticed such a difference in height before. In the end, after she thanked him, he turned around and started to leave. He told the girl to rest and that in the meantime he would go. Sapphire meanwhile ran up to him. She suddenly put her hand on his and said that she was very grateful to him for saving her. She also called him His Highness. The man immediately became wary and asked how she even recognized him. After all, he had specifically bought the seller's mask so that no one would recognize him. Well, the girl smiled and said that it was not difficult for her to do this. He was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, so she could easily understand who he was. Then Sapphire stood on her toes, took off his mask and said that it was really very easy to do, and the man even became a little embarrassed. However, Leander said that does this mean that she saw everything that happened earlier, even how he left that club? The girl replied that this was exactly how it was, and the man was very upset because he tried his best not to catch her eye. However, he failed. After a short silence, he looked away from her and said that he just went there to pick up a friend from the club, and there was definitely nothing more that she could think about. The princess laughed loudly and said that he definitely didn't need to justify himself to her, so he could calm down. The man approached the door again and asked her to pretend as if she had not met him. Then his voice became serious. He said that he thought it would be better if Felix did not find out about this event. The girl suddenly frowned and said that she knew perfectly well that she really understood who Felix was and that it was better not to tell him. Well, at that moment, she became a little scared. She didn't know what to do, but soon she was able to calm down. Smiling, she said that she was still grateful to him for that day because of the rescue, so he didn't have to think about it. Leander looked at her for a while after that. He asked if she had accidentally wanted to tell him something since their first meeting. The girl thought about whether everything would be okay if she really said what she wanted, because he was, after all, the one who ended her suffering in her past life. However, despite this, he was still the third prince of Valorea and Felix's brother. The girl believed that he had no reason to put himself in danger for someone like her, whom he practically didn't even know. However, besides this person, Sapphire had no one she could rely on. So the girl had very mixed feelings. She did not know what to do. Also, before leaving, the man turned to her and said that if she didn't want to say anything else, then he would really go. After all, he still had several important things to do. But Sapphire stopped him and said that she really wanted to run away from Venetia. She spoke in a serious voice and also added that she was not going to marry Felix. Leander heard this, of course. He was not surprised. The man only looked at her with a serious look for a while and tried to understand what he should do now in this situation. The man noticed that despite the fact that this was only the second time they met, her eyes, for some reason, were filled with trust in him and perhaps even expectations. He did not understand this at all because he did not give her any hints or reasons. For a man, this was something very unusual and perhaps even irresponsible. The way she desperately fights as if she already knows the course of her fate in advance amazed him. He wondered if the princess really had some very serious past, since she already knew what she absolutely should not do under any circumstances. Of course, after all this, he became even more interested in the girl, so he was not going to miss the chance. Leander came closer to her and asked why she even thought he would agree to help her. At that moment, the girl looked down and thought about what she should do. These words simply burst out of her mouth, but for some reason he took them very seriously. Now, for some reason, he expected more detailed answers from her, but she was simply confused. She really hoped that he would treat this as nonsense and not take everything seriously. When Leander saw her worried expression, he immediately asked what was wrong. He said that if she asks someone for help, then it is best in such cases to show her sincerity, especially since he was practically her enemy. Leander smiled, tilted his head towards her and said that she should have understood that she was essentially a hostage, and asked if she thought that he could tell Felix about what she had just said. Of course, Sapphire understood that he was simply intimidating her. In the end, she pretended to be scared and said that she wanted to run away precisely because she understood everything perfectly well. So she hoped that he could help her with this. The girl explained that she didn't want to become a hostage to Felix, because it would have been simply terrible. Then Sapphire spoke loudly and said that if he didn't help her, then fine. She would just stay in this place and live comfortably like a stupid crown princess. Many royal marriages were only superficial relationships anyway, and if all goes well, perhaps she could even become empress in the future. The girl herself thought that if it didn't work on him, then she would just look like an idiot. So after she finished speaking, she was simply silent for a while. Leander, meanwhile, did not take his eyes off her. He only stared intently at the girl. She was very surprised by this and asked why he looked at her like that. The man still didn't respond to this. Sapphire was even more worried because this event hadn't happened in her previous life. So she thought about the possibility that the butterfly effect had changed his life too. She even thought about the fact that perhaps he would really change his mind and help her. At that moment, the man finally started to do something. He took a small thing out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said that it could definitely help her. When Sapphire saw this thing that she immediately recognized, the man at the same time responded that she should not easily trust other people and should always be very careful. The girl already wanted to answer him something, but she didn't have time because he turned around very quickly and slammed the door behind him. Of course, she was upset about this because she still wanted to tell him so much. But in the end, she couldn't. Then she began to examine the thing that he gave her and realized that she still did not fully understand what exactly it was. However, she assumed that perhaps this life would become a little easier for her precisely thanks to this thing. So she was still grateful to the man for such a gift. Of course, Leander was the person who ended her suffering in her previous life. But in this life, she did not want to use him because he still had his own life, and it also had to end in tragedy because they shared the same pain. And even if Sapphire couldn't do much, she still wanted to help him live peacefully and happily in this life. So she was ready to make every effort to do so. However, she couldn't tell anyone about this, so she had to keep her mouth shut and calmly come up with a plan of action. At that very moment, Leander had already gone outside. He was very angry with himself and did not understand why he had given her that dagger in the first place. In fact, her grandfather and mother were knights who even defeated dragons, so he believed that she should be able to use weapons herself. In the end, he reproached himself very much. The man did not understand that if she mistakenly thought that the dagger was a sign for her suicide, he couldn't stand it anymore. The man decided to go to her and explain everything properly. As soon as he ran into her room, he saw that the girl was presenting a dagger to her belt. Leander immediately screamed loudly and said that he did not give it to her so that she would harm herself. The girl, who had deliberately placed the dagger in her belt so that it would not be visible, smiled and replied that she understood this perfectly well and was going to use it to defend herself. At that moment, the man realized that he was a real idiot and did not understand how he could even imagine that she could misunderstand this. Landers finally said that he would very much like to just pretend that they didn't know each other from now on, without even waiting for her answer. He ran out the door again. Of course, Sapphire was amazed. She didn't understand why he was behaving in such a strange way. However, she decided not to focus too much on it. She thought that it was indeed true that he was rather capricious, and the rumors about it were at least not a lie. Immediately after this, the man mounted his horse and began to run away from there, in order to avoid doing even more stupid things. And one of Felix's assistants, whom Neville hired to keep an eye on him, saw this and was very amazed. Of course, after he saw all this, he immediately went to report to his master, who, along with Neville, even choked from shock, because they certainly did not expect to hear such a thing. The man looked at him and asked if he was really saying that the Grand Duke of Leander was gay. Of course, he looked at him with great suspicion and did not understand how the assistant could even think about this. But the spy bowed and said that he had seen it all with his own eyes, and that what was most important was that he had entertained two of these guys at the same time. At that moment, Felix realized that this was all some kind of misunderstanding. He smiled and asked if the man had really decided to mock him and make a fool out of him. The spy immediately became indignant and said that he had been following His Highness the Grand Duke for several days and had not heard anything about him entering the hotel with two guys from the club. However, His Highness the Grand Duke seemed to regret his actions, and from now on he shouted at them to pretend to be strangers in order to deceive others. Accordingly, he assumed that he did not want this information to be revealed. His Highness was well aware of his position as a member of the imperial family, so Felix could be sure that this was all true. The man still couldn't believe that it was true, so he sent away his spy and was left alone with Neville. At that moment, his friend smiled happily and said that this was indeed very interesting and quite important information. But Felix did not agree with him. It all seemed like some kind of nonsense to him. He told Neville to find out the identities of these men and not allow any outsiders to find out about all this. The man immediately said that he would do everything after this. Felix changed the subject of the conversation and said that it was time for them to begin their preparations for the banquet. His friend smiled and asked if he was planning to announce his engagement to Lady Sapphire at this event. The man then looked at him with a serious look and said that his father was putting pressure on him, and this was a good opportunity to help her understand her place in society. So he simply had no choice. Neville, stirring his tea, replied that he would definitely make sure that the banquet went off perfectly, because that was important. The guy himself thought about the fact that he probably didn't like the way she smiled at the Grand Duke, and that's why he was going to do such a dirty trick. A few hours before this, Nellie actually went to the princess's room. She knocked and asked if the girl had woken up yet. Since she didn't receive an answer, she assumed that she was still sleepy, so she decided not to worry and leave there. Nellie was quite envious of her because she could sleep as much as she wanted, even though she was a hostage in this place. And besides, she was interested in what Ellie was doing in that case because her job was to wake up the princess. So she decided to just not get involved in all this and leave it to the responsibility of another maid. Many hours had passed since then, and another maid who called her asked how it was possible to sleep the whole day, since the princess had not left there the whole day. She was very angry and asked Nellie if she had forgotten the order of the senior maids, how she could have let this situation slide. The girl was a little upset because they started to scold her here. She said that they couldn't be rude. After all, this was the princess's room, so they couldn't enter without her permission. However, Eva, her assistant, could not simply leave this situation. Therefore, when she entered the princess's room, she noticed that she was not there. As a sign of punishment, she hit Nellie very hard on the cheek. She immediately screamed at the girl and asked what this was all supposed to mean. Nellie screamed back at her and said that she didn't understand how this happened. The door was locked from the inside, so she assumed that the princess was just relaxing. At that very moment, Sapphire immediately returned to her room. She turned to them and asked what they were doing in her bedroom and what the problem was. The maid immediately became angry when she saw the princess. She shouted loudly at her and asked where she had been all this time. Eva yelled at her and told her to watch her tone, after which she apologized for her partner and said that they were very sorry that they entered the room without permission. Sapphire walked past them and said that everything was fine, after which she replied that Elle showed her the palace and they got a little lost because of this. Ellie explained to her partners that she was also unfamiliar with this place, and it was because of her that they got lost. Therefore, she asked everyone for forgiveness. Finally, Sapphire threw the robe over her shoulders and asked if they had finished clarifying the circumstances. The girl told the maids that she had spent the whole day on her feet and was very tired because of it, so she would like to go and rest early. Eva immediately bowed to her and said that a few minutes ago, a special message had arrived from the royal palace. His Highness, Prince Felix, invited her to his mansion in 5 days for a special banquet in honor of her arrival in Vanesh. The maid also explained that, at the banquet, His Highness was planning to officially announce his engagement to her, so she needed to get some good rest after that, and they turned around and started to leave to really put her at ease. Sapphire was very shocked by the news she heard. She realized that she had returned just in time, because otherwise everything could have ended very badly. But the girl herself tried to understand why he decided to announce their engagement so soon, because this had never happened in her previous life. Some time passed before the moment came, and the next morning the maids in full force went to the princess to help her change her clothes. When they knocked on her room door, Sapphire allowed them in. She was a little surprised that it was already time to change clothes. She stood by the window and wrote something down in her notebook. When Eva entered the room, she said that this banquet was specially prepared to announce her and Felix's engagement. An engagement is very important for the empire. Therefore, the banquet will last from morning until evening. Sapphire said that now she understood that it really had its meaning, but she herself, of course, was not happy. The last few days, the importance of this engagement had been hammered into her head so many times a day that she was already tired of thinking about it. She turned to the other two maids, namely Ellie and Nellie, and told them to prepare clothes for the princess. For some time, the girl had already been wearing a corset, and Nellie was directly involved in this matter. She asked the girl to take a deep breath, and then she was going to tighten it properly. After she tightened it too much, Sapphire immediately asked her to loosen her grip a little, because she was having a hard time even breathing. But Nellie didn't listen to her. She just told the lady with a smile on her face that a lady present at a banquet should show herself in her most beautiful form. Therefore, it was better for her to just be patient. Of course, the maid did this on purpose because she hated her. After she continued to tighten the corset, Ellie intervened and asked her to stop doing this, because this was really enough. But the maid did not listen, and she said that this was still not enough. After which she asked the princess to take another deep breath and hold it. Sapphire didn't want to get involved in any scandals, so that's what she did. After that, the girl tightened her waist even more, and in the end, she tied the ropes and everything was finally ready. At that very moment, a dark-haired man drove up to the Sapphire extension. His name was Gal Lambert. He was the fighting captain of the Imperial Knights. Another of his assistants said that their captain had drunk too much again in the evening, and because of this he was still sitting in the carriage. When the man heard this, he immediately became very angry, because it was really very important, and he, as always, ruined everything by drinking too much alcohol. But the wolf who had already come out of the carriage immediately calmed him down and said that he had been worrying too much about other people's business. For some time they argued in front of each other and had unnecessary conversations in order to pass the time, and eventually the wolves came to the conclusion that perhaps he did not even need to bring Gala. The guy, of course, was angry about this, because he believed that if it weren't for him, the man, as always, would have ruined a lot of the battle. So he considered himself quite important in accompanying the princess. At that very moment, Sapphire finally came out of the estate, already dressed in a beautiful dress. Her hair was also very beautifully styled. She looked incredibly neat and delightful. When the man saw her, he was very amazed. Of course, he imagined the princess completely differently, especially considering all the rumors that circulated around her person. Wolves immediately stepped forward, bowed before the girl, and said that he was the captain of the pirate knights, and by order of His Highness the Crown Prince, he had come to escort the princess. The girl looked at him and was a little less than thrilled because she knew he had drunk too much again. She could smell the alcohol, even though she was a long distance away from him. Sapphire also thought that if they were not in public, she would have refused kisses with the back of her hand from such a smelly person. However, since etiquette required it, she simply had to endure it. After all the formalities were completed, the girl began to get into the carriage. When she was inside, the wolves said that they would arrive in half an hour, so she could rest a little. They immediately set off, and Sapphire could also see Sergal from her window. In fact, a very long time had passed since they last met. It was even in her past life. In fact, the Lambert family were the emperor's personal executioners, responsible for purging the members of the imperial family, staining their hands with blood. They were shadow creatures who secretly eliminated the political enemies of the imperial family and maintained the stability of power. If it weren't for the schemes of Count Wilhelm Lambert, her grandfather would never have been called a traitor. It would also not be an exaggeration to say that the Lambert family used the Andres family as a platform for their rise to power. This political conspiracy strengthened the control of the Reiki shaft. He completely suppressed the influence of the emirate, but soon after her death, he took the sword and also took control of the imperial palace. Sapphire had only met Gaul a few times in her previous life, and she didn't even remember having a good conversation with him. With these thoughts, the girl rode the rest of the way, and finally the promised half hour passed, and they approached the imperial palace. When Sapphire got out of her carriage, the ladies who were present at the event immediately began to whisper among themselves. Of course, she would become the topic of their conversation that evening. One of the girls said that she heard that His Highness, the Crown Prince, did not even come out to greet her. She was completely alone. Sapphire heard all these conversations perfectly well. However, she ignored them. In her past life, she shook from such insults and was incredibly ashamed. However, now she understood that she didn't care at all about all this. She even thought that if she had paid more attention to what exactly they were talking about, then perhaps Felix would not have deceived her so easily. While the wolves were walking, he immediately waved to many women. He really hoped that this evening he would be able to meet someone and have fun. However, when we saw him, we immediately ran in different directions. He and his partner talked about this for some time, and the girl thought that he was too tactless and said terrible things even about women. At that moment, the wolves suddenly looked around and saw that all eyes were focused on Sapphire, and also how they began to whisper to each other, clearly discussing her. He thought that if it were an ordinary young lady in such a situation, her heart would have broken long ago. However, Sapphire behaved very nobly. The princess, in turn, was a truly extraordinary person. So it is not surprising that the Landers spoke so well of her and had a high opinion of the girl. Despite all this, he still noticed how small she was and wondered what people eat anyway. Usually people from the southern regions eat this, because he was 2 heads taller than her. Sapphire did not think about anything like that at all, but found herself completely confident that even in her past life, she walked the red carpet in the same way. She was surrounded by ridicule and bullying from noble people. She was always so overcome by these negative emotions that she couldn't even breathe normally. Sapphire now couldn't believe that this time, even knowing all this, a similar situation was also suffocating her. In fact, it wasn't all about all these looks and ridicule. It was all because her corset was too tight. She really just couldn't take a proper breath. At this point, the knights turned to the princess and said that this was the maximum distance they could accompany her, and asked if it would be difficult for her to go further on her own. The girl said that everything was fine. She thanked them for accompanying her and said that she was very pleased to do business with them. But then, suddenly the wolves approached the princess. He said that he still had to tell her one thing, and then he made his voice quiet so that prying ears would not hear them. He warned the girl to be careful that the dagger on her belt was not visible, as it could attract completely unnecessary attention to her. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately checked her dagger with her hand. She did not understand how he knew about this, and because of this, she felt even more uncomfortable. But the man also said that her awkward behavior was very noticeable, so it was best to act as normal if possible, after which he asked her for forgiveness and began to leave with his partner. As soon as they moved further away, Gal kept looking around and looking at the girl who had, meanwhile, gone to the palace itself. When the man noticed this, he immediately asked if he was really that worried about her. The guy didn't answer this question, but only asked what he thought she was planning to do with this dagger, especially while in the imperial palace. The man replied that no one knew this. In any case, it was definitely not for murder. Perhaps she could use it to peel an apple. Or perhaps she simply wanted to calm her heart in this way. Sapphire, meanwhile, went to the palace. She looked at the man and realized that despite the fact that he was very unpleasant to her, he had a rather high power of observation, for which she was grateful. And all because it was vigilance and observation that helped her notice the fact that she was behaving unnaturally. And accordingly, she was now going to control her. When she went inside, Leander also went in after her, and that was it. Yes, we immediately started approaching him and pestering him. The girl was a little surprised because she had no idea that he was so popular. She thought that his reputation was terrible. However, she was wrong because everyone was looking at her with apprehension. While Leander was on the show, a whole crowd of women followed him who really wanted to talk to him and ask him about a lot of things. But suddenly the man noticed Sapphire, who was walking past him. He immediately decided to act and ran away from her in a completely different direction, so that they would not cross paths. The girl saw this and immediately smiled. She was certainly not stupid enough to greet him in such a situation. However, she was surprised by the fact that he actually ran away from her because of this. She went further, where there were the least people, and, sighing heavily, thought about how she thought she could rely on him. However, she realized that she had expected too much from him. At that very moment, Leander, who was hiding behind the wall, scolded himself very harshly. He did not understand why he had run away from her so stupidly, and while he looked out the glass doors to check if the girl had left, another lady suddenly approached him and called him her brother. It was a black-haired, beautiful, thin woman. When the man saw her, he immediately realized that it was Lyle. She was Lander's younger sister. He greeted her and asked if she had already finished her sword training. The girl replied that everything was exactly like that. After that, she asked why he was hiding in this place. The guy started coughing because he was embarrassed. Then he replied that he was simply being followed, so he had to run away. When his sister also looked out the window, she saw a lot of yes that were there and said that now everything was clear to her. Then Lyle went ahead. She said that she was very hungry, so she suggested going and seeing if there was any food at this banquet. Sapphire, meanwhile, set off to walk the red carpet again, all eyes still directed at her. She realized that she had become the main source of gossip for these terrible nobles. This irritated her madly. The corset was becoming the same and the same, so she realized that it was best for her to send it away as soon as possible. Otherwise, she would simply suffocate because she would not be able to take a breath at one moment. Then she saw the stairs that led to the second floor and assumed that there was probably a living room there. So she decided to run away from all these looks and pressure there. As soon as she went upstairs, she decided to go out onto the veranda that was located there. The girl realized that she could finally breathe because it was not as hot there as in all the other rooms downstairs. Then she went out into the hall and, looking around, realized that at the end of the corridor, there was probably a locker room. Sapphire immediately went there, but as soon as she heard footsteps behind her, she immediately froze in place. The girl knew this step structure very well. It was Felix. She thought that she was no longer afraid of him. However, the moment she turned and saw him, her whole body trembled. She was excited, and an indefinable fear washed over her like a tide, something she had never experienced even in her past life. At that moment, her whole head was filled with memories from her past. The girl immediately grabbed her head and tried to stop this flow of thoughts. She didn't like it at all. Felix, who approached her and saw how worried the girl was, stood and watched for some time. And finally, he extended his hand to her and said that he was very glad to meet her. The girl realized that she needed to calm down in order to change her future. So she overcame her fear, put her hand in his, and smiling, said that she was also very pleased to meet him. She believed that she would never again allow herself to give in and act according to his rules. Now she was completely different and deserved better. When she bowed before him, Felix smiled and said that many ladies were eagerly waiting to finally talk to the princess, so he suggested that she go back down. He said that when they saw him, they all asked where she went, but Sapphire smiled politely and replied that she didn't know many of these people, so she hid on the upper floor in order not to feel uncomfortable. After this, she asked him not to laugh at her, thinking that she was a child, and hid because of some kind of fear. The man ignored this phrase. He only asked if everything was okay with her. After all, he noticed how difficult it was for her to breathe. Sapphire replied with a trembling voice that she was fine. It was probably because the room was a little hot, and because of that, she was sweating a lot. Felix, meanwhile, came closer to her and said that he really wanted to be someone she could rely on, despite the fact that she came alone. He would like to become a reliable shoulder for the girl. Therefore, moving even closer to her, he said that if she really felt bad, she should not be shy and should definitely tell him about it. In fact, in her past life when she was sick, he was really kind to her. This intention was her only hope. It warmed her heart while she fought on the other side. Indeed, in her previous life, having seen such an attitude towards herself, she believed that perhaps he could have become an ally for her. After all, he supported her so much, but the girl was very wrong. She trusted him completely, at least until the moment when he accused her of poisoning, which the girl did not commit. Then he showed his true nature. And even if he hates someone so much that he wants to kill him while standing right in front of him, this does not mean that he will immediately do it. On the contrary, the man will try to gain this person's trust. It was only after Felix gave her love and hope that he made her dependent on all of this. And after that, he saw her cry and scream in pain because of this ultimately broken illusion. And then he saw how she slowly fell into hell, and he rose as the very one person who caused her so much pain and suffering. It was truly the most brutal revenge that could be imagined. And for Sapphire, it was simply an unimaginable blow. He allowed the girl to live in the developing palace and silently allowed people to gossip, and at the same time he looked at her tenderly. Of course, Sapphire now understood that all this time he was pretending, so that only she would trust him. All these tenderness and kind words were always part of his plan, and it made him even worse as a person. Sapphire could hardly stand next to him. It was very unpleasant for her to even look at Felix. While the girl was thinking about her own, Felix finally turned to her and asked if she was irritated. He noticed it from her facial expression.